Okay, so one of the areas of Russia that has made news since the end of the Soviet Union has been the region of Chechnya. Like many of the other pieces of the former Soviet Union, Chechnya also claimed its independence, but unlike Azerbaijan or Armenia or Ukraine, Chechnya was not recognized as an independent country after the Soviet Union fell. The Russians felt that it was part of Russia. It deserved to remain part of Russia. So the Chechens are still fighting for their independence. The main reason Russia wants to keep Chechnya is because it is very oil rich and has good farmland, which is not just completely rare in Russia, but it's good to have as much as you can. Russians also fear a domino effect. They fear if they lose Chechnya, if Chechnya becomes independent, then they'll lose other parts of the Russian Federation also. So they're afraid if Chechnya gets its independence, then this area will get its independence, and that one over there, and that one over there. So the Russians claim the Chechens are terrorists, and part of that could be an Islamophobia. The people of Chechnya are Islamic or Muslims, so labeling them as terrorists kind of places them as, oh, they're Muslims, they're terrorists, which is not always true. Muslims aren't always terrorists, I promise. But it kind of puts in the minds of Russians that they definitely are, so, we have to fight them. But the mountainous terrain of Chechnya, because it's in the Caucasus Mountains, allows a lot of these small militias and small armies to hide in the mountains. And there was actually a claim by the Kremlin that Vladimir Putin escaped an assassination attempt by the Chechens, which was maybe true, maybe not true. Also, these Chechen rebels have allegedly bombed bus stations and train stations and kidnapped kids in a movie theater and attacked schools. So there have been lots of things the Chechens have been fingered for maybe doing, but we don't really know if it really was them or if it's just Russian media trying to scare Russians and justify a reason for fighting against Chechens. Another issue of the post-Soviet era is nuclear bombs, and it's been the topic of several movies. I think there was a Bond movie, James Bond movie like that, where the the former Soviet nuclear weapons, well, after the country split, where do these weapons go? Who owns them? If we have weapons in Ukraine, does Ukraine get to keep them? Or do they go back to Russia? Or where do they go? So the poorer countries may be willing to part with the old bombs if they get the right price for them. So that's where Iran or North Korea or some other enemy state that we view as such could step in and purchase said bombs. One of the big things that drives the Russian economy is oil and gas. And oil and gas is found in the places listed there, including Siberia. And the Russians want more exploration and more pipelines because the more oil they produce, the more that can be sent to Europe, especially. And state-run, the Lukoil is the state-run oil company that provides a lot of revenue for Russia. So there's a lot of very powerful people, many of whom are friends with Vladimir Putin, who work for or work with Lukoil. So there's a lot of money moving around through oil. Russia has been in dispute for almost a century now, actually over a century, over the Kuril and the islands of Sakhalin. So the islands just above Japan. So they're still yammering back and forth about this, but there's no resolution to it. We still don't know. I mean, Vladimir Putin has been to Sakhalin, he's been to the Kurils to say, hey, these are our islands and you can't take them, and we will fight you for them still today, even though there's so much land out there, mainly because there's oil on Sakhalin. That's the main thing. There are lots of famous Russians, writers, like Tolstoy, if you ever read War and Peace, long, long book. People who dance like Pavlova or compose like Tchaikovsky and Baryshnikov. People of science like Pavlov. He's famous for his psychological study of dogs that when a bell rings, the dogs salivate because the bell was attached to the door. And when you open the door, the dog salivated because they heard the bell. There are sports stars, tennis players and hockey players, ice skaters, but there's a lot of famous Russians out there. Russia is a superpower. It is the leftover from the Soviet Union, which the Soviet Union was one of the two superpowers during the Cold War, and it used a lot of Eastern Europe to keep its economy up. And Russia today still has veto power in the United Nations, meaning if an issue comes up in the United Nations that um, that Russia can step in and say, no, we don't have to take action on that, which is why, even though this war is going on in Syria, the Russians, who have a naval port in Syria, keep saying, no, 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 we don't need to do anything in Syria. That's an internal issue. We don't need to do anything about that, which a lot of other people disagree with. This is a graph of the population of Russia. As you see, in 1992, they were at 148 million people. By 2006, they had lost about 6 million people, and that trend continues today. These graphs, I love these graphs. They're so great because what they do is they show ages of people and the number of each age of people. So people in their 45 to 50 in the US who are male are right here. This is the baby boomers in the US. But as you see, the younger ages, we've kept constant here in the US. In China, they had a big boom of people who were in the 45 to 50 range. But then they kind of slacked off, especially the female numbers in China, but a lot of Chinese people nonetheless, because of China's one-child policy. Germany, you see it slowing down of people from born in 1975 or so and afterwards, mainly because of widespread birth control. So we see a decrease in the number of children. So you see that. But here's the interesting one, Russia. As you see, there are just a few old people, a whole bunch of middle-aged people, but then after, in the past 20 years, so we're looking at times after the collapse of the Soviet Union, after 1990, the Russian population has shrunk severely. So there have been a lot less Russians born in the past 20 years. So if this trend continues and the group above here dies off, then what you're going to have is you're going to have a really, really small Russian population. Which part of the reason why people are leaving is because of inequities, especially in gender. A lot of, well, not a lot, but many Russian women decide to become mail order brides. They decide to become women who are who get on a website and just want to marry an American man. Why? Because they want to get out of Russia. They want to live in a better place. Others become sex slaves, which is really sad to realize, but yes, it does happen. That's part of the reason why the Russian mafia is still successful today, is because they're moving these young women who are 12, 13, 14 years of age around the world to become sex slaves. There's also a gender gap in pay. Women get paid less than men, but there are more women than there are men because the men tend to drink more alcohol and die more and suffer more from depression. So women in Russia, a lot of them want to get out. So issues of today. Corruption, still a big issue. Main person behind a lot of that, Vladimir Putin and others. Some people in the former Soviet Union want communism back. They long for the days when the government provided everything for them. There are lots of young alcoholics and drug users. Pollution, still an issue. We looked at Chernobyl and the nuclear pollution there. There's industrial pollution, sewage pollution. Voter fraud is still a big issue. because even though Russia is a democracy, there are questions about how free and how fair the elections actually are. And there's a lack of free speech and free press, newspapers and TV, in Russia, uh, which we'll get to in a second. You also have places like Georgia, the country of Georgia, and South Ossetia. South Ossetia is an autonomous region inside of Georgia that Russia has claimed to um, protect. And when the Georgians tried to go into South Ossetia, the Russians fought back and pushed the Georgians all the way back to their capital city. So Russian troops are in South Ossetia to protect Russians who live in South Ossetia. And the Georgians are fed up with Russians in Georgian territory, but Georgians do not have an army that is even close to strong enough to fight off the Russians. Other old Russian states have a lot of Russian history, a lot of Soviet history, but they seek financial Western help or Russian money help, but don't know how to run an economy, or they're unfamiliar with democracy, or they have to decide, do I trust Putin or do I trust outside non governmental organizations like the EU, like the International Monetary Fund? Um, do I want to trust them or Putin to help me? Because I need help. All young countries need help to help get established. There are issues of, do we lean more toward Europe or Russia for these satellites for places like Ukraine or Belarus or Georgia? Do we favor Europe or do we favor Russia? Low government pay leads to bribes. So, a police officer who gets paid $5 an hour, he's going to pull people over and say, I could write you a ticket, or you could just pay me some money and then you won't have to worry about it. HIV and AIDS are huge issues in Russia. And this is more recent. A critic, a guy who greatly opposed Vladimir Putin, was shot just dead in the streets. And he's not the only one. There are lots of these writers, journalists, political people who oppose Putin that all of a sudden end up dead. They're poisoned or they're shot or they, strangely enough, end up dead via suicide. But there's this long laundry list of people who magically disappear. Anyway, so that's the former Soviet Union for you, right there.